So this is a new project that was funded by NOAA. And as you all have heard across the world, the US is in kind of a state right now in terms of how it's going with NOAA. We don't know if we're going to get the rest of the funding for this project, but we have a year of funding and we're like, we can make a paper with a year of funding. So I'm going to tell you about what we're doing with that, and then also what we want to do given 2 more years of funding. And this is in collaboration with, can you guys see this little thing that I'm moving around, or is that hidden?
We can see. We can see.
Okay, I'm going to move you guys over there so you don't have to look at yourself. Is that better? With Howard Townsend, who is at NOAA, and this is a very serious, if you know Howard, he doesn't ever look like this. David Chigueras, who's at University of Florida, who is an ecopath with EcoSim modeler and works with management. I'm sure some of you have interacted with him. And the goal of this was really Howard's idea to have infrastructure development for regional fisheries modeling and going from climate projections to fisheries management. And so I am an ocean modeler, and my specialty within FishMIP has been to how do we use Earth system models effectively to plug into fisheries / ecosystem models and not do wacky things. And so let me see if I can get the next slide going. Okay. So, and because the US government is no longer called climate ecosystem modeling infrastructure development, it's called changing ecosystem modeling infrastructure development, aka SEMFISH. And I should say that Victoria Garza, who is on the call, who is the scientific programmer in my lab, has made all the plots that we're showing here, and Karen Rojas, who just joined my lab. She was a master's student in my lab and now is working on this project, will be highly involved too. So SEMFISH background, and here's a fun AI image. Warming, you guys know this stuff, but warming oceans, acidification, and habitat shifts threaten species distributions and ecosystem dynamics. And the current models focus on individual regions, lacking cross-regional or national insights. So this is some of the inspiration for this effort. And the idea is that a climate-ready fishery system must integrate biological and climatological models. So I will tell you that this is a talk I made a while ago where I just fed the proposal into AI, and it made bullet points for me, and then it actually did pretty good. Okay, so the objectives of the project are to determine the best practices for climate model use for ecosystem modeling, and that's a part that we're really focusing on now. And then use those to make future projections of regional marine ecosystems and evaluate the fisheries management implications. And the idea is that instead of doing one study for one region, we're really developing a methodology for doing this in the best way that can be applied, like across FishMIP, for example. And develop an operational framework then for everybody. And so objective 1, this is LSU, that's us, is identify the critical ocean processes for specific regions and species. And this is going to be really, depending on where you are, what fish you care about, is it the timing of the spring bloom, or is it, the bottom temperature has to get over the threshold. So it's really going to depend, I think. And that's one of the things I would love to get feedback on today. And so then determine the usability of the climate projections for the region. And again, I think that's going to depend on the fishery. So I think that's part of this story, is figuring out how do we do that effectively. And then, best case scenario, develop a toolbox for ecosystem modelers. And I'll talk more about how that relates to FishMIP. And so I just want to plug this paper we did in 2023, demystifying global climate models for use in the life sciences. And it has this great flow chart of so you're a life scientist, you're an ecologist, how do you start doing climate scientists? And then, you define the problem and you solicit expert advice. And I'm always like, that's me. I know about climate models, pick me. And then there's a whole flow chart that happens here of the steps you go in. So I encourage you to look at that and, uncertainty and evaluate the model selected. So those are some of the things we're touching on here, but specific to the fisheries and marine ecosystem modeling. So I think I said a lot of this before, but some things that could be important: bottom temperature, seasonal dynamics like timing of the spring bloom, river nutrient inputs. That's something we have in the current forcing for the historical protocol. And these need to be determined in cooperation with local fisheries modelers, like what are the important things in your region. And this isn't something we've done before. We've just been like, here's a 1 degree climate projection, you let her rip. So how do we do better at that? So model validation. Do the models represent the key processes for the marine ecosystem and fisheries in question? Bias correction, as promised, using observational and reanalysis-based data sets to correct discrepancies. And then we also want to get into statistical downscaling, which we've kind of talked a little bit about in FishMIP, but we don't really have like this is the way you should do it for us. And so if you have expertise or you have opinions about this, we would love to hear from you. So the paper we have in preps, I've outlined the paper is best practices for translating climate projections to ecosystems and fisheries. There's 2 projections in there. It's a rough draft. And so the outline sections are how ocean models are used for ecosystem and fisheries modeling, picking and validating models. I'm going to talk about this today. Bias correction, dynamical downscaling, so like regional submodels, like embedded ocean regional models, statistical downscaling, ensemble approaches like we use in FishMIP, but also using ensembles of forcing like we also use in FishMIP. And then we have some sample studies. And so the idea is that David is going to do some ecopath with ecosim simulations for US fisheries, and we're going to see how making these changes in bias correction, for example, would affect the those projections. And then the discussion is ecosystem-based management integration. And then I think I'm gonna like skip this because we don't have funding for this yet. And I'm kind of gonna go into like the idea is that if we get enough funding, we could hack the FishMIP, our shiny app, and make it better. We don't have that funding right now, so stay tuned. I'll let you know if that happens. But one of the inspirations we had for the bias analysis was this thing, the International Ocean Model Benchmarking Project. And this came out of the Oak Ridge National Lab, and they also made the International Land Model Benchmarking Project, which really revolutionized land like models and or system models. And so I don't know, there's some really cool stuff in here. So Victoria's been hacking it, and she found a bug in it, which I think was we were very stoked on that. It was like, it's always a good day for a coder if you find a bug in some like very learned person's code, right? Like, or maybe it's a disappointing day. I don't know. Like, I'm sure we all have stories about that. And so one of the questions we've been asking is, can we leverage and adapt this for ecosystem modelers? And so it has like some like biogeochemistry stuff, but it doesn't have anything, for example, about MPP or plankton or anything like that. Things we care about. And then the objective 2, and I'm just going to go through these future objectives. Again, we don't have these funded yet, but these are what we want to do, is do ecosystem projection. So using existing marine ecosystem models, which David Chagaris has for the Gulf of Mexico and the US Atlantic, incorporate climate drivers like temperature, salinity, and acidification, and then analyze the species shifts, trophic dynamics, and ecosystem resilience. And then from that objective, plug that into fisheries management. So simulate combined effects of climate and fishing pressure, assess species productivity, and propose adaptive management strategies, highlight uncertainties in climate scenarios and their management implications. And I think that last one is really important, and I think is a place we need to go as a community, is really getting a handle on climate uncertainties, internal climate variable like ENSO, and then ecosystem uncertainties. And really, if we're going to make management decisions, we really need to get a handle on our uncertainty. And I think this is a good project for us all to chip away at, to get, in our little things we do. And then the fourth objective is to make an operational framework, like some kind of decision support tool with some workflows, and collaborate between NOAA and FishMIP so that we could develop things that everyone in the world could use. Again, if we get the funding. I'm going to skip that. And then I'm also going to skip that because I'm preaching to the choir. Okay, so preliminary results. I have a question. Do people in other countries have alphabet soup? Does anybody know what this is? Is this like a US thing? I see some laughs. Like I don't know if like anybody knows. So in the US, we have this thing called alphabet soup. And I always think like when we're looking at all the models, right, there's so many acronyms and it's alphabet soup. It's just like a bunch of random letters. So this first slide is like, okay, what are all these freaking acronyms I'm going to be throwing at you for the next couple slides? So our preliminary like pass at this was to test a variety of simulations, so Earth system model, ocean simulations, with the same ocean model to assess how different resolutions and forcings affect the major drivers that we care about for fisheries modeling. So we're starting with the GFDL, the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab, which is the NOAA lab here in the US, the MOM6, the Modular Ocean Model version 6, Earth system model in different configurations, so different resolutions, different places, because we've used this, right? And this is a NOAA supported project, and we've used this in FishMIP 3A, 3B, and whatever the 2A or 2B, I can't remember which one it was, but you know, the CMIP 5 one. So GFDL is the Earth system model. So it has the atmosphere, the ocean, land, and ice. MOM6 is the ocean model component of this model. And then Cobalt, like if you look on the EasyMap servers, it says Cobalt, that's the ocean biogeochemistry and plankton model. So it's, you know, it's got diatoms and diazotrophs in it. And if you put that all together, you get GFDL MOM6 Cobalt. So that's the alphabet soup. Or sometimes it's just called GFDL ESM 4 or 4.1 or 4D. I don't know. I don't even know what the 0.1 and the other things are. And that's all in John Dunn's paper. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about GFDL models. And so the drivers to test, which should be pretty obvious, is sea surface temperature. And we're going to start with chlorophyll because it's easy to get validation data from that, from ocean color. So these are satellite products that are global, pretty high resolution. So they're really the most easy first steps. And then the harder to get validation data that we're still working on is net primary productivity, and I'll talk more about that. Plankton biomass, bottom temperature, and these, you know, plankton biomass, there's very few direct measurements. You can't get it from satellites. So we need to use like modeled products, like an NPP is an ocean color-based model product. As is like biomass, you take like the copepod database and you like, you know, I think, what is it, a GLMM like model of some climatology of like zooplankton biomass. And then we have like combined data sets, which take like all the observations of bottom temperature and then interpolate them in some smart way. And then we have these reanalysis models, which is kind of a whole thing. And that will be like a future talk about what those are exactly and when they work. And so basically those are like kind of best estimates of the historical past based on ocean models, but then doing data assimilation with different data products. But that's like a whole talk. Okay, so just to talk about NPP, and I would love some audience feedback here. These are 3 NPP observation-based models. So this is an NPP from space. They all come out of the same lab, the Oregon State Ocean Color Lab. And so they're different, right? How are they different? Sorry, I'm a teacher. How are they different? Jerome, I'm going to call on you. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, no, sorry. No, actually, I don't remember, but there's just a correlation from the correlations, the empirical models used.
No, I just was asking you, like, looking at them, how are they different? You don't have to, like, give, like, I read the paper answer. Just, like, give me the basic answer. Yeah.
No, yeah, but between the subtropicals or higher latitudes, you clearly see differences, for examples. And yeah, the mean as well is different. Yeah.
Yeah, so they're very different, right? And like if you look where Jerome is, like off the coast of California, it's a little bit red here, it's a lot red here. And if you look, for example, in like the North Atlantic, they're all very different. And so then this is the CSM. This is a future non-release version of CSM. And so how do you decide if this is a good MPP, given that these three observational MPPs are so different? And so, this is a question we're asking. And so I think maybe what Jerome was starting to get to, like who has probably read the papers, is all of these three different models are based on different assumptions and different validation data sets. And so I think we need to ask, where are the fish on the coast? Which one, or which combination of them averaged together, which a lot of people do, like Kristen at NCAR, is best for our applications. Like which of these are getting the coastal productivity right is kind of my first pass at that. But if you have ideas, again, like put them in the chat, send me a message. I need to watch the time because I like talking about this stuff. So I'm just going to go on and on. Okay. So preliminary results, the initial models being tested. So we are using models we've used for FishMIP before. And again, there's going to be a lot of alphabet soup. There's the EasyMIP, GFDL, CMIP6. So these are the CMIP6 simulations that we used for FishMIP 3B, the Tittensor paper. We here are just analyzing the historical simulations. And it's important to note that these are fully coupled. So there are future simulations, but we're just going to be looking, because we're comparing with observational data, the historical, the past, because we have observations. These are fully coupled ocean atmosphere historical simulations. They don't have ENSO in the right place, for example. So we have to take long-term means in order to validate them properly. So these have a 1 degree global resolution. This was 0.5 degrees. In the CMIP6, like if you go on the Earth System Grid Federation like database download portal, it's 0.5 degrees. But when EasyMIP took them in and harmonized, they were all regridded to 1 degree. So we're just using the 1 degree ones we used previously in our paper off the EasyMIP servers. And then, and is there any questions about that anybody wants to ask right now? You guys are not a loud bunch. Okay. Feel free to raise your hand. So then we're using the GFDL high resolution hindcast simulations. These are the ones we're using for the current protocol, the 3A protocol. And these are quarter degree, so 25 kilometer resolution. And they also have river nutrient forcing. So the coastal productivity will be different because they have this nitrate loading in the coastal regions. And then we're using a regional dynamical downscaling. So a regional, again, GFDL, MOM6, Cobalt. For CEFI, this is the Changing Ecosystem Fisheries Initiative, because we can't say climate anymore. And this is another NOAA project that got recently very much gutted. So we're hoping that we can help buoy the dream of it. And I have like an image of this here. So this is just for the West Atlantic. So it's basically Gulf of Mexico and the whole like East Coast and the Caribbean. So we're going to be looking at this model. And it's again, a higher resolution, 8 kilometer, 1/12 of a degree. And this is also a historical reanalysis forced. So it's forced by an atmospheric data product, just like the GFDL high resolution hindcast. That is our best estimate of what the atmosphere was doing. So it does have like ENSO in the right time and place. And there were some changes to the plankton model to better represent coastal productivity. So they like changed like the diatoms or something. And this is in Ross et al., this Ross et al. Paper. Okay, so just the first steps here is just looking at it. And so the pixelation, you'll see this is the model. Well, in this case, this is the resolution, the 1 degree that it was regridded to harmonize that with all the other global models. And what we're comparing with is the optimally interpolated sea surface temperature satellite product. This is a NOAA product. This is the reference for it. And so that's what this looks like here. Let me change my pointer to laser. Okay, that's what this looks like here. And then this is what the model looks like. And again, we're using a long-term mean so that we can average out any variability in terms of, in this case, and so you can see if you subtract them, so this is just the bias, it's cold. And if you take the root mean square error, which makes it so you don't cancel out positive and negatives, in this case it's still negative, in other cases that will matter, you get a 0.75 C degree cold bias. And you can see kind of a hint of the Gulf Stream here, but it's not very resolved at this resolution. And why this is pixelated in the same way this is pixelated is that Victoria regridded the OISST to the model grid resolution in order to do this analysis. Any questions about that? Did I explain that well? Is that clear? Okay, thank you. So then moving up, so there's 4 grid boxes, lat and long. So there's 16 grid boxes here for every 1 grid box in the last slide. And this is the GFDL high resolution. This is what we're using now for the historical simulations. So you can start to see, like, there's a lot more resolution of the coast here, and you can see the Gulf Stream more. And when we look at the difference here, just this difference in the SST, you can see this like red stripe, which we are interpreting as the Gulf Stream moved farther inshore than the observation. So the Gulf Stream has a offset. So the Gulf Stream is a major current in this region. It's a western boundary current, and it's quite warm. And it also might be a little bit hotter, and there are papers getting into the details of how to assess that, if it's a spatial shift or if it's like a temperature shift. But it's not, so there's some biases here, but we still see this cold bias in this inshore region, like on the shelf, which again could be important for fisheries. And then if you look at the root mean square error, you get 0.9 C. And et cetera. We can go into the even higher resolution, and we see something similar. So if we put that all together, so this is the Cepheid 8-kilometer simulation. So we can put that all together in a table, and we did this for all of the large marine ecosystems in the Atlantic in North America. So Gulf of Mexico, Southeastern, we were just looking at the Southeastern, the Northeast, which I'll show in a second, the Scotian South, Labrador, and the Caribbean. And in general, we see a bias improvement with higher resolution, which is what we tend to expect as we go to higher resolution. We're better representing coastal currents, upwelling, but not always, right? So like here, this Cepheid hindcast has, like some of these go the wrong way. You'd think it would be getting better the whole time, but then it doesn't. So I guess these all are going the right way. No, this one gets worse. So we go from 1.75 to 0.9 to 0.965. So it's a higher bias for the higher resolution. So let's look into that a little bit for this northeast coast. So you can see again, and this is a warmer bias instead of a colder bias. And so kind of like, I guess my big question is for the regional modelers, like, so for the people who are doing regional modeling, is this spatially pixelated representation of the bias useful, or would it be better to like average the temperature and then subtract? Is that more important? So I think that's kind of something we should think about when we think about how to use this for what we're doing. But basically what we're doing here is we're just kind of developing our methodology. And then the idea is we can turn the crank and add in more variables, which is what I'm going to show next. So we can do the same thing with chlorophyll. So the chlorophyll we're taking here is from MODIS. And we haven't gone through a thought process of like, is this the best chlorophyll product to use? We're just like, let's just grab one and see what it looks like for now. And then we're going to vet them more in the past. So this is the, in the Northeast here. So this is like New York's like right over here. This is Cape Hatteras. The Gulf Stream goes out here. This is Canada. This is the US. And you can see that there's a lot more productivity. There's a lot more chlorophyll in the satellite data than in the model. And that's expected. In general, we're missing a lot of nutrient inputs into the coastal region and small scale upwelling, even at this 1/12 of a degree, 8 kilometer resolution. And again, we can play the same game where we calculate the root mean square error on all of these. And so I'm just showing the MODIS here. And then when we regrid it, it gets very pixelated. So we can do this analysis on the 1 degree grid that the GFDL, the CMIP6 EasyMIP 1 is. And again, we see the same pattern is sometimes we go and it gets better, but then it gets worse. And so is that a good metric? Would it be better if we interpolated the coarse resolution model to the OISST? Would an average over the LME be better? This is something I would love some feedback on. And so the next steps for this is we're going to utilize a normalized bias metric like IOMB, because like for these, you kind of have to know like, well, what's the average chlorophyll? Okay, it's around like 1. And so, you know, what is a bias of 1 mean? Well, that's like, you know, 100%. So that's kind of a big deal. But then for this, the IOMB, they have a normalized bias, so you don't have to do that mental math. And I'd also like to have an indication of the positive negative mean bias for SST, like is it colder or warmer? Because that can be important for a lot of fishes. And then we're getting into seasonal biases. And we've kind of done that a really dumb way where we just took seasonal means and then calculated the RMSE. But I think we also want to get into phenology, like timing of when blooms happen for chlorophyll and PP. So that's kind of like the update on all the bias assessment that we've done so far. Does anybody have comments on this before I go into bias correction? Yes, Daniel.
Yeah, a question. So at least it seems that the resolution is very important. But are these models also based on a slightly different run, or can you say that the mathematical equations and the forcings, etc., are more or less the same, and it's really the resolution that drives this, or could there be also a difference in just the dynamics of the models?
Yeah. So this is a really important question. So let me get into the details of that a little bit. First of all, we are using the longest time mean we can to do this so that we average out interannual or eddy variability in the case of an 8 kilometer. So we're averaging some of that out. So if we just compared 1 year to 1 year, yeah, we wouldn't have a lot of intelligent things to say. So that's part of it. That's how you deal with, especially this one, because it's not constrained by actually observed winds, for example. These two simulations have the same, I believe the same forcing, though I need to double check because I haven't finished reading this paper. The same reanalysis forcing that is based in actual historical winds, radiation. So it's going to have the same clouds kind of thing. So that's going to be similar. However, does that answer that part of your question? Does that make sense? For chlorophyll, this has a different plankton model. So you would expect that the chlorophyll would be a little different because the plankton are functioning differently. And then gonna like depend in different regions, it's gonna depend on what's going on. Like in this region, we're getting kind of towards the edge. You know, so if we go back to kind of the model domain here, so we're looking in this region. I guess we're not at the model edge, is way up here. But as you get, there's like currents that come in along from the north. and there's currents that come in along from the south. So I think they pretty much captured that. We're getting that. But so how those regional currents are resolved by the model is really important for the details. And that, again, depends on the physics of the region and what's important for fisheries. So I think like some kind of iterative process of combining ocean modelers, physical oceanographers with fisheries modelers is going to be critical for really closing those gaps. Am I answering your question? Yes. Okay. Any other questions on this or comments? How are we doing on time? Okay. I'll keep going. Okay. So, so this is kind of zooming out. It has there's some repetition here of the previous slide, but this is like a more, we actually did this earlier. This is like a zoomed out global view. And this is the GFDL high resolution. This is the historical simulations that we're using right now for the FishMIP 3A protocol, the FishMIP 3A protocol. And so you can see kind of this global bias. And again, this is averaged over decades so that we can get rid of insodynamics. But you see there's like a consistently like cold bias in the North Atlantic. It's really hard to get the overturning simulation right, overturning circulation right in all of these models. So this is not surprising here. I don't know, there's lots of stuff to think about, like why, you know, looks like the Kurashio's off or something. And if we kind of zoom in on the West Coast, this is what we were looking at before, you can see like, oh, yeah, the Gulf Stream is not really in the right place. Something happened here. But then the question we were asking is, given, so this is a globally averaged, this is a globally averaged SST. So this is the optimally interpolated SST in black, and you can see the GFDL uncorrected in blue. And you can see that the global sea surface temperature, they are like going up and down with each other. And that's because this simulation is forced by historical actual observed winds. So it is going to get like the variability correct. But it has this bias, but then the bias goes down and we're like, we don't know why. That's an interesting question. So many interesting questions. But then what do we do about it? So what we were playing around with was some bias correction. And this was a methodology that my PhD student, Gowrie Anil, used and spent a lot of time thinking about for coral reef bleaching work, because we wanted to do bias correction to get the bleaching right, because it's kind of a, you know, the threshold is an important thing there. So SST really matters. And the methodology she decided on that she really liked was quantile mapping. And if we have time, and I think from Daniel's intro, maybe if we have time, I can talk a little bit about the details. And so what you can see when we do the bias correction, and the idea with the bias correction is that it's gonna preserve like the highs, like it's not going to get rid of the extremes, which was really important for the bleaching, and I'm guessing would be important for fisheries as well. So I think that I have some time, I have enough time that I can talk a little bit about the methodology here. And these are some slides that Gowrie and Victoria put together. So I'll do my best to represent this, but she's in India right now, so she's not, it's like 3 a.m. So quantile delta mapping is a technique that adjusts the modeled variable to match the distribution of the observed data. It uses an interval independent behavior to ensure that all of the time series is taken into account based on the observed data relative to the control period. So basically you're taking a statistical approach. And the limitations are that predicted values are adjusted to match the statistical distribution of the observations. So if your statistics of extremes and stuff is changing in the future, like the shape of your distribution, like there's some kurtosis. I mean, if it changes a lot, I don't know what you do. Like, I don't know how you determine, because it's the future. We haven't observed it yet, but that's the limitation of this. I think we just have to live with that though. So what does it do? It looks at the observed data and the model data, right? Like I was showing before, we have this global SST time series, and it compares them by looking at quantiles, which I think a lot of people are familiar with. So instead of taking the mean and the standard deviation, we divide it up into these chunks, the 10th, 50th, and 90th percentiles of the temperature distributions. And then you calculate the differences, delta, between the observed and the projected quantiles, and you adjust the future data, or in our case, we were adjusting the historical data by adding those differences, deltas, to the future projection. And so I'm probably not explaining this well because I don't understand it that well, but I can, in a future meeting, I can have Gowrie come and tell you all the gory details. This is very different than what the IPSL group has done. This is like, given an Earth system model, what do you do to correct it? And they have a very different thing that they're doing, which I'm not prepared to describe right now, but it's not the same as this. And then, so you take that statistical knowledge, and then the delta method is how you project that into the future. And again, the limitations are that you're assuming the variability stays constant over time. So I think that's enough of that for now, and I'm happy to share these slides if you want more, and you can talk to Gowrie. So, but the point is that we can bias correct this, and we can do that. So we can take these regions that have these strong biases, and we can correct them. And we do that on a pixel by pixel basis, on a grid cell by grid cell basis. So we are adjusting each grid cell individually based on the statistics of that grid cell. Are there any questions on that? Was that helpful at all? I feel like I'm not. I wish Gowrie was here, but I think you get the idea, right? Yeah, Danielle.
Yeah, maybe one question to get it in context. So what the regional modelers are doing is slightly different, right? Do you know? Or
no, that's on my to-do list, is to bug them and find out what they're doing, and we haven't done that yet. So we need to compare with what they're doing. I think, well, what we did for the protocol was something very different, where we didn't worry about extremes. We just used, no, I do remember, because I remember we had long conversations about this, and I actually think I was part of why we're doing what we're doing. So now it's coming back to me. What we did was very, very simple, is we just use a climatology. So we didn't use the quantile mapping. We used a much simpler methodology to do the delta. So you basically are just saying, what is my bias in my climatology, and then I'm going to correct the future based on that without worrying about extreme temperature. So it doesn't have as much statistics in it. And I think when we developed that methodology, my lab hadn't thought this through. So I think it's going to be a really interesting question. And I think we'll get to that in the paper of which one is better for what we're trying to do here. Like, I think, like, my guiding principle is do the dumbest thing you can possibly get away with, like the least complicated thing you can do that is defensible and doesn't give you a weird result, right? So if we can get away with a very simple bias correction, that's fine, but we have to explore more how to do that and think about things other than temperature too. So I think that, does that get at your question? Yeah.
Yes, thanks.
Yeah. So I don't think I have it here, but like, so here we're using an observational SST product, but we don't have that for subsurface temperature. So then we need to figure out, well, where are we going to go to get mid water column and bottom water temperature? Where are we going to go to get, pH, when we don't have observations of that everywhere in the world? And so probably where we're going to need to go is these models that are these reanalysis products that do some kind of data assimilation of all of the observational, like, ship data to constrain the historical. And we call those observations. We pretend those are truth, and we use those to correct. And so that's something we're going to be exploring here, is how does that work, and how well does that do to get us where we want to go? Right. So bottom temperature data and comparing with other models. So we are going to look at the CSM. That's the other high. So the JRA is the forcing data set, the atmospheric forcing data set that you use. So it would be comparable to the GFDL high resolution model we're using for the current 3A protocol, but it would be a different ocean, a different Earth system model and a different plankton model. And again, like Karen Rojas has joined the team, and she's an expert in ocean data products and ocean modeling and ocean state estimation, like data simulative models, so she's got lots of skills that are relevant for this. So just kind of like some ideas, like I think these are more like big picture, long-term ideas of how we can make FishMIP work better for regional models is to like, can we add more validation variables to the Our Shiny app and improve the color maps for bias plot? And so this is one of the goals we have over this year. And then to further hack the International Ocean Model Benchmarking Project to get more into the different metrics. Could we adapt that? Could we combine it somehow with the Our Shiny app? Would they be friends? Can it be adapted for regional applications? And really we'll get into that if we have more funding, because I think the goal is to make something that's really usable for everybody. I have a question from Cecile. Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the model comparison, because we have one Earth system model that is based kind of in Bergen, and I was wondering for the comparison, will you compare models that kind of have their eyes in a specific region that it's kind of developed? Because the one that is based in Bergen is the focus is on the Northeast Atlantic, right, to get the Gulf Stream working, because we depend so much on it.
Yeah.
Well,
so you're
I guess
talking
that
about the fisheries model, and yeah. At first I thought you were talking about the Norwegian Earth system model, and that's not what you're. Yeah. So the idea is that, like, given like a region, like you could hand me a shapefile, and we could crank this same analysis out for you. That would be right. So if you're like, hey, I have a shapefile, Victoria, can you make that like, grid for me for my region? Is that wouldn't be that hard for us to do. Does that make sense? Yeah. So we just started with this region because we're funded by NOAA, and it's a US.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
No,
But,
I was just wondering about the kind of the specific ocean model comparison that you mentioned on the previous slide. If those are picked to be as different as possible, or if they're kind of both based and kind of US based models. I'm just curious.
Yeah, so I just picked these because we've used these for FishMIP, and then we're funded by NOAA, and NOAA makes these models. But these two are global. So you could hand us a shapefile, and we could do this analysis for your region. That's kind of that's the goal of this, is that if you hand me, we just picked the LMEs because it was like that's the dumbest shape to use, right? That large marine ecosystems. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. Yeah. So, so we could easily look at other regions. And I mean, I think for the paper, we'll probably end up making like all of the LOEs. Or I don't know yet. We haven't quite decided what we're gonna do, but seriously, if you want to just your shape file, Victoria is incredibly efficient. I think that was the idea, is like, right, at Victoria, like once we get this set up, like it wouldn't be that hard to crank it out. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. Yeah, Daniel.
Yeah, the question on this bias correction. So say you have a method that allows you to bias correct temperature, and well, let's say temperature, but the underlying, say, for example, cobalt, still runs with the model temperature. So the zooplankton production rates that
Mhm.
that model
Mhm.
estimates
Mhm.
will
Mhm.
be based on maybe higher or lower temperature. So I
Mhm.
was wondering if you know
Yes.
if people have tested if there's a risk that you amplify the bias by diverging the two inputs
Yes.
essentially.
No, this is exact. We have had conversations over the years of like, should we bias correct temperature? And I was like, exactly what you're saying. That could lead to really weird states of the ecosystem where temperature is bias corrected, but zooplankton are in another universe. So that's a really a really interesting question. And I think that and that's something you're welcome, like if you wanted to run like a little test model, like for your, like if you think you have a regional marine ecosystem model that is specifically sensitive to something like that, it would be an interesting case study to run for this effort, this writ large, and this we can put it in the paper if you have the energy for it. So having some case studies of like, we're all about best use practices, like what works, what doesn't work. So I have the exact same intuition of you as like, well, if I just correct temperature, is that going to screw everything else up? So ideally, we would not just correct temperature, we would correct everything based on whatever best estimate data product we could find. So we would go, take the COBOL database and take the climatology of the model that's based off that. I can't remember what it's called, the GLMM, and like use that to bias correct zooplankton biomass, mesozooplankton biomass, for example. But I think it's going to depend on the structure of your marine ecosystem model and what's driving it. Some people are just using NPB. Some people are using mesozooplankton biomass. So like we have to figure out those details are really going to be critical. Otherwise we're getting into garbage in, garbage out, right? Like, and got to be careful. Yeah. Yes. Jordan.
I've while we were chatting, I had a bit of a chat with ChatGPT here on the site. It's my statistical parrot that can be quite useful sometimes to understand a bit better what you're talking about. And what I can see emerging here is for FishMIP, we can see a pipeline, a very modular pipeline in which we can tackle the bias in environmental drivers, we can tackle them in fisheries, and then bring those to the Earth system models where we can then check ourselves, our model specific bias corrections. So I can see a very nice picture emerging that we can, if we break down the big problems in smaller bits, at least it doesn't become so overwhelming.
Yeah.
And we can also switch hypotheses in the pipeline, what you're saying now, different ways to tackle different drivers for which you don't have observational data. If we structure it in a nice way, we can come up with something very cool.
Exactly. And then the goal is to empower the ecosystem modelers to understand the biases, to be able to like visualize those and grapple with them in a way that makes sense for their model that they understand and know so much about in their region, right? Because like the Benguela is going to be really different than the Mediterranean, like in terms of like how it works, like for the ecosystem, like they're very different systems. So like the different biases are going to be important in different regions, and different models are going to need different types of bias correction.
Well, and just as for instance, we are working with the multi-step validation tool that Nina wrote about, right? That based on the HIPSI paper, the multi-level validation tool. There is, well, if you want to validate ecosystem models, there's a generic validation part, but there's also something that is highly specific to the internal structure of the model itself. So we'll always have these more generic aspects and the technical details. But,
can you send that to me, please? I think we need to talk more. I think we need to set up a meeting and talk more, and I need some feedback on because I think I know about ocean model validation, but I don't know a lot about fisheries model validation. And I think like there's some conversations that need to happen there where we really are talking to each other.
Nice. Well, you're in good company already with Dave and Howard, but I'd love to join.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Yes.
Yes, please. You are invited. Thank you very much. And everybody else too. Like if like, this is a community project is how I see it. And so, and this is something I'm so glad we have some funding for, because it's something I've been thinking, oh my gosh, we need to do this so bad for years. Right. And so it's great that we are able to take a first pass at some of these questions and then coordinate with everybody in what the parts that they're picking up and dealing with. So yeah. Okay, well, I think that was the end, and I have this weird AI image. Oh wait, there's more questions. Okay, great. I'm down. Okay. I think Jerome, you have 2 hands up. Like, does that work? Can you have more than 1 hand up?
Actually, I
Oh
wonder.
no, that's the number. Okay, Joran, I'm sorry, I'm not used to this interface. Joran, I think you're done, right? Yeah,
It
okay.
was an old
Jerome.
hand. My hand was falling asleep. Yeah.
Yeah. You're like, no.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, very interesting. I was just wondering because it's more like a comment. At the beginning, you stressed how like these variables, like they're identifying how different models are representing them, will be used for like there is a strong need to inform fisheries model. So I was wondering like what about like say derived variables, like for example habitat compression, like how these models are getting the, like for example in California, you know, the upwelling compression, the internal variations matters for the different communities. So
I mean,
how
yeah.
can,
Keep going. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
no, actually that's kind of it. Like also you mentioned the timing of different, like the phenology, the seasonality. How like are these variables like in this kind of frameworks, or will they fit into it? I'm just like suggesting.
Yeah. So exactly. Like I did my PhD in the California current, and upwelling is everything. Upwelling timing is everything, and it's the same across all the eastern boundary upwelling currents, right? So these are really critical. Some of these you would get just in a straight up temperature bias, but exactly that, the seasonality is going to be really critical. And I think that's an example of really kind of going back to and to get at the upwelling timing and then the productivity signal that comes from that, the spring transition in the California current, as they call it. You could look at chlorophyll and NPP and when is it peaking. So the seasonality assessment of the NPP should capture that. And that's something, Victoria, we can test using the global models. And I think there's also a regional part of CEFI. There's a West Coast, like Mike J. Cox and those guys are doing the West Coast one. So that's something we can start to assess. I feel like that's a second pass, right? That's like the first pass. But I think like going back to this, like this model of like, find an expert. So if you were a fisheries modeler who was starting in the Bering Sea, I would say go find someone who knows about the ocean physics and chlorophyll and modeling of that region, and go make friends. Go make friends with them and like get them to help you figure out what's going on and how to assess it. And the same thing with the California current is exactly those questions. So I think that, again, I think we can start to do some of this modular, as Joran was saying, like, but it's not going to ever take the place of working with local oceanographers who have like deep knowledge of what currents are important, in your region of interest. I think that's really critical here. That's step 1.